Hello, my name is Katie O'Dare, and I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Student Life at Boston College. Welcome to Veritas at Vinum. Veritas at Vinum is a conversation series that features prominent faculty and administrators sharing their stories, how they began their careers in higher education, the people and events that had an impact on their professional development, and what it means to them personally to work at a Jesuit and Catholic university. Archived conversations can be viewed at the Church in the 21st Century Center website. Thank you, and enjoy the conversations.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Some of you may remember that this was scheduled earlier in the semester, and then we had that snowstorm, so we had to adjust the schedule. And little did I realize, though, that this is the last one of these, so I don't know what that says. But I know the format is essentially to have the person who is speaking give some personal history, offer some observations maybe about what that particular individual does, and then allow you as grad students an opportunity to ask me questions about some aspect of my life that I may have mentioned or something that I didn't say that you'd like to hear about. And that could include life as a priest, administrator at Boston College, and how I view Catholic higher education. But to set the context for what I'm about to say, let me give you a sense of how I ended up here. And I want to start with where I began. And as some of you may know, I have Iowa roots. I don't know if there are any Midwesterners here. I met at least one person who used to be in the Midwest, but originally was in Anchorage, Alaska. So I say coming to the Midwest from Anchorage that's probably a good move on somebody's part. But I'm a native of Imogene, Iowa, which is a little Irish Catholic farming town about an hour's drive from Omaha. And when I was growing up, I may be the only person you have ever met in life that went to a one-room rural school. When I was in kindergarten, there was one teacher, 9 grades, and maybe 17 or 18 students in the first school. Morning Star was the name of that school. And then eventually, when my parents moved to another farm, I went to a second rural school. And I look back on that with great fondness because in the rural school with one teacher and 9 grades, students who were in the first and second grade could listen in on what was going on in classes ahead of them, and the students who were in 7th and 8th could, at other times of the day, help the younger students. So I look back with great, great fondness for those experiences in the rural school. And then I went to a Catholic grade school for 3 years, onto a public high school in a town nearby. And then when I was in senior year of high school, I had thought off and on for years. Some of my earliest memories are of thinking about being a priest. But I was at a public high school, and I really didn't know quite how to go about the discussion of considering seminary education. The priest who had been pastor of our parish in Imogene for 40 years was ill with cancer during my senior year of high school. So there was no resident pastor. We had priests who filled in on the weekend. And so in my senior year in the springtime, not knowing what I was going to do, I decided I would go off to college. I went to Creighton U in Omaha, another Jesuit school, where I studied in the College of Arts and Sciences, but all the way along there were these thoughts of priesthood. And my link to priesthood had been through diocesan priests. But at Creighton, I met Jesuits. And so while I was at Creighton, and largely because of my roommate who got into all kinds of trouble, I got to know Jesuits quite well because we were trying to help my roommate, and Jesuits were trying to help him as well. And eventually, he got helped right out of school. But through my roommate, interestingly enough, I got to know members of the Jesuit order. And so in my second semester of freshman year, the issue for me was not whether I was going to come back to Creighton, but what was I going to do in regard to priesthood? Either be a diocesan priest for Des Moines, Iowa, the diocese headquartered in Des Moines, or this new interest, new calling, new desire to become a Jesuit. And so in June of 1967, I started the process to become a Jesuit. I was accepted in August, and I entered in September. And that was September 1st, 1967. I had never been to the place where the Jesuit training started. It's a place 30 miles west of Minneapolis, St. Bonifacius, Minnesota. I was there 3 years, 2 years of the novitiate training, and then another year of what we call junior age studies, more classical languages, literature. And then in 1970, I was assigned to study philosophy at St. Louis University, which I look back on and I say I wasn't ready to study philosophy because I didn't really have any questions. I could absorb lots of facts, lots of information, but I think to really get engaged by philosophy, it helps to be able, or to have an interest in questions, to be able to wonder. But I look back and I say I was too young for philosophy. I hope none of you are studying philosophy here in this group, but I was too young. This is now 1970 to 72, so I was 22, 24 years of age. But I stayed at St. Louis U for 2 years majoring in philosophy and history, and then at the end of that philosophy period, I also stayed there for a third year and did a master's in American history. And I picked American history because I've always liked it. And when I was asked by my superiors, did I want to do a master's degree in some field before I went off to teach, which is part of our next phase of training, I said, sure, I'd like to do American history. So that's what I did. I liked history. I liked to read. I still like to read. And so I did a third year at St. Louis U, moved over to the main university community, which was a wonderful experience. The first 2 years, I lived with about 120 other younger Jesuits. In my third year, I lived with the St. Louis University Jesuit community, which was probably 75 to 80 men, but these were the faculty administrators at St. Louis U. And very important, and this is something I would say to you as you're thinking about your future lives in the academic world, very important to have people who can, the in word today is mentor you, but someone you can talk to, someone who can share their experiences about how they ended up doing what they're doing, what led them into a particular course of study. And I was very fortunate at St. Louis U. I had two older Jesuits. One was an administrator at the university, who was a Jesuit named Jerry Marchetti, and the other one was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And there were 3 or 4 other scholastics, non-ordained Jesuits, at St. Louis U at the time, living in the same house. So we scholastics and these older priests would have some wonderful conversations about life and the society of Jesus and where higher ed was going and what should we do. And at the end of my master's studies, I was asked where did I want to go teach. In the Jesuit training, and it's still true for a lot of us today, there is a phase called Regency, and in my time, we mainly went to high schools to teach. And since I had not gone to a Jesuit high school, I thought it would be valuable to go to a high school where there was a very intense experience with boarding students and day students. So I ended up teaching at Campion High School, which is at that time was in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, a boarding school of maybe 300 students. And I lived in a residence hall, taught history and religion, was there 2 years, had a great time at Campion. Campion had a great motto, give Campion a boy and get back a man. And it had that on a big sign outside the town of Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. And every now and then in the springtime, on days like this, some of the seniors would get out their little paintbrush and they would, that sign had black background, and they would paint in white paint, give Campion a boy and get back a maniac. And then we'd rush out on Sunday afternoon, Monday morning, and paint that sign so it would be back. Today we'd have cameras on that. We'd know who was doing things like that. But after Campion, and Campion was a school that closed in my second year of teaching. Ordinarily, Jesuits then taught 3 years before they did their theology studies. But I only had 2 years, and that was a big question. Where would I go? Because Campion closed in the springtime, And ordinarily, there would have been a process of selection of where would these scholastics go for their theology studies. And I had grown up in the Midwest. I could have gone to Chicago. We had a school of theology in Chicago. And a friend of mine was heading out to Berkeley, to the Jesuit School of Theology there. So I asked if I could go to Berkeley. That was kind of all it was. Could I go to Berkeley? And interestingly enough, my rector, the Jesuit superior, when I came to Berkeley, is now living in St. Mary's Hall. His name is Father Bill Russell. And he always, in the right moments, will say, I took you in when you were just a little orphan coming in from the Midwest. But I was at Berkeley, and it was during my years of theology study that I would say I began to wonder and to think and to really engage. And prior to going to theology studies, if you had asked me what would I do as a Jesuit priest, I would have answered that I would end up in a high school. In fact, I was probably on the track to be a high school teacher and eventually a high school principal. But in theology studies, I began to have many more questions. I really enjoyed theology. And as was often the case, the superior, my provincial, would come around and ask, what do you want to do after you're ordained? What do you see yourself doing in the form of ministry? And I began to say, I'm more and more interested in the intellectual apostolate, higher education. All the way along, these Jesuits I had met at St. Louis University kept talking about higher education. My family, as I mentioned, was from Iowa. I would stay at Creighton, and I knew a number of Jesuits at Creighton. So in many ways, I was socialized toward higher education and the intellectual apostolate. And there came a day when I had to choose. I was being considered to go to Creighton Prep in Omaha as an assistant principal, or did I go off to do a doctorate? And again, history was the field I liked, and the provincial said, well, do whatever you prefer. And I chose to go into higher ed. And the advice I got was do that PhD program in an academic discipline, not simply a program that you may get done quickly, but do something you really like and enjoy. And so I ended up at Stanford. I stayed on the West Coast, lived at the University of Santa Clara, and went to Stanford for a degree program in U.S. history. And when I look back on my time in higher education, the greatest time was doing the research for my dissertation. I couldn't say I liked doing the papers for my graduate work, but I love doing research. Having a question, finding little nuggets of information, piecing things together, and then forming that into a whole. That was a great intellectual experience. And I had a wonderful dissertation director. I would come in and I wanted to write on Jesuit education, and he would say, why? And I'd come and say, well, because it's important. He'd say, why? And I could bring him some material that I was working on. He would say, well, what's the significance of this? Why would anybody want to read about Jesuit schools, or what Jesuits did, or what happened in Catholic schools? And finally, one day, I said, Catholic education is very important because that tells a lot about how Catholics changed and adapted to American culture. And he said, that's what you want to write on. You want to investigate why certain key changes occurred in Jesuit higher education as a window on the adaptation of Catholics to American culture. So, for instance, why did Jesuit schools go co-ed at varying times? Some in the early part of the 20th century, others later. Or why did we end up with so many larger schools and professional units attached to those schools? It's all part of the Catholic culture wanting to change, wanting education. Women wanted education, or Catholics wanted to be physicians and doctors and lawyers. And the Jesuit schools were primarily undergrad institutions focusing on liberal arts. They changed. So I look back on my doctoral research as just a great time. And I can say I like to have written. I like to have written. But writing is not easy. It takes time. It takes focus. My dissertation director would take every Thursday off. He was a faculty member but also a part-time administrator. He saved every Thursday, and that was the day he wrote. he could pick up his writing from one Thursday to the next. He was rare. After I was done at Stanford, I returned to the Midwest. I'm part of the Wisconsin province, which is headquartered in Milwaukee. The Society of Jesus in the United States is divided into geographic areas called provinces. And when I was nearing the end of my doctoral program at Stanford, I could have gone to Creighton, or actually I interviewed at BC, believe it or not. In 1985, I came here. Father Neenan was academic vice president. And there used to be, in what's today the Players Club, I forget what the name was of that little, like a little restaurant there. Remember they had lanterns in it, and I was there in 1985 being interviewed. But I had no interest in BC at that time. It was not on my radar screen. I was a Midwest person, am a Midwest person. And Marquette U had a position that was open in my area of history. My focus was 20th century U.S. So I went to Marquette, and after being there for a while, I had always wanted to live in a residence hall, so I knew I was in pretty good shape on tenure. So I moved into a residence hall, stayed in a residence hall 5 years, did a fair amount of teaching of courses in the basic U.S. history survey, history of education, religious history, worked a little bit in the administration of the history department, and had just gotten tenure in 1991, and that May, the president of Marquette asked if I would become the executive vice president. So I left teaching in 1991, began working as a full-time administrator, really learned on the job about administration. I had never been department chair or a dean or a vice president prior to becoming executive VP. So I learned a lot. And when I look back on what is critical, I think, for a beginning administrator, I'd say there are two things. To be successful administrators have to have an idea of what they want to achieve. They have to have a certain vision. Vision's just critical. What's the goal set? What's the dream? And then administrators have to be able to make decisions. And a lot of times you don't have a great deal of time to spend on that decision, but you got to be able to make a decision and then move on. But I would say the two things I look for today in administrators is I look for vision and I look for the capacity to make decisions and then get on with life. If people agonize or they get all torn up inside, I think they're going to burn out when it comes to the world of administration. So from 1991 until 1996, I was the executive VP of Marquette at a time when Marquette was in a fair degree of turmoil, enrollment issues, financial problems, neighborhood issues. I remember saying to people that when I came to Boston College to become president, I had dealt with every issue that I ran into in my first couple of years as president because Marquette had them all except gambling in athletics. My first fall here, we had an issue over gambling in the athletics program, at least a lot of accusations about what was going on within the world of sports at BC. And the reason I came to BC and left Marquette U was not so much because I had this great link to the New England province or to Boston College, but it was because it was part of the Society of Jesus. It is a Jesuit school, and it came down to a discernment on my part. I thought the greater good was being president of Boston College as opposed to being the executive vice president at Marquette U. And that's how I came here. In fact, I remember being interviewed by one of the trustees in the spring of 1995 in a hotel room in New York, and the first question was, well, why do you want to be president of Boston College? And I said, we need to get something straight from the beginning. I'm not the one that wants to be president of Boston College. You asked me to come and interview. And there's a lot of freedom in that because I didn't pursue this position. And I think of myself today as a Jesuit priest who happens to be president of Boston College. I'm not the president of Boston College who happens to be a Jesuit priest. Being the Jesuit is the defining part of my life. And what I do in my current position is a form of ministry for me. I don't teach in the classroom. I don't have the sustained contact with students that I had when I was living in a residence hall at Marquette U. It's different. I deal with alumni and benefactors. I try to do something with students at least once a week. There's email, there's travel, but it's all, for me, a form of ministry. And I, after 12 years, still say that it is a form of ministry. Just as I think you, as graduate students, are engaging in a form of ministry. And it is a calling. It's a vocation to be lived, being engaged in the intellectual life, whatever the discipline may be. But as Ronner once said, life is about question and quest. And you have your questions, you have your journey that you're on, but it's all part of a vocation, a calling. And it's how we live that out that I think is so very, very important. And I would say what's very sustaining for me is, back to that word vision, there are things that I believe Jesuit and Catholic higher education should be about. That's very sustaining, to have that sense of purpose, the larger view, not getting caught up in maybe the everyday or something that's a particular issue, maybe a troubling issue, but to have that larger sense of vision that this intellectual apostolate, this work, this program of study is worth doing, not only because I, as an individual, enjoy it, but because it touches other people. It's apostolic. And that at the root of it all is why Jesuit education exists. It's a way in which the Society of Jesus believes, and it certainly has history on its side, that we in our schools can help shape wider culture. It's a way of working for the greater glory of God. So that vision is very strong. I also think no matter what we are doing, who we are with in life, we need time to be alone, to pray, to reflect. There's a passage I like very much in the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel that says, pray and not lose heart. And I think we live in a day when it's easy for individuals to become discouraged or not feel the kind of support or enthusiasm, especially if it's a doctoral program and you're trying to write that dissertation. It's easy to get discouraged or somehow lose sight of the larger goal. So having that time for prayer, and I do believe God works. I don't think it just is by chance that I ended up at Boston College. I think there is ample manifestation, ample evidence that God is at work. So vision, prayer, and then I think what's just been so sustaining in my life is a range of friendships. I entered the Society of Jesus at 19, never having known Jesuits in high school, but in my years in the Society, I've met so many wonderful individuals who are very much part of my life to this day, whether I was in studies with them in Minnesota or out in Berkeley, or individuals I've worked with at Marquette or here. There are people all over the world that I have known who are Jesuits and very close friends of mine, but also I have a number of lay people, both here and at Marquette, that I taught with, worked with, that are very, very important. And I'd also have to say a number of students that I taught both in high school and at Marquette are still people that I keep in touch with. Individuals whose lives intersected with mine, and we still have links. So how I ended up here, grace of God, I think, and then, of course, the invitation to become president of BC. But when I was your age, well, maybe not, when I was your age, I probably knew about Boston College. But I know when I was entering the Society of Jesus, BC wasn't even on the radar screen. I didn't even know it. I'd never visited BC till the early 80s. I came here to do some research for my doctoral dissertation, stayed at St. Mary's. This was 1983. And then I wasn't back until the late 80s when I was doing my last phase of Jesuit training. So that's kind of the personal history. There may be other things that you'd like me to comment on. I could say a little bit more about leadership, what I think are pitfalls for leaders. I think there are two big pitfalls for leaders in our day. I think one is the very human need to be liked, becoming so powerful that individuals won't risk being criticized or maybe losing some personal relationships. I think that keeps people from being leaders because they never want to step out away from their comfortable peer group or take a position that may generate some kind of reaction. So I think that need to be liked can control individuals and keep them from being leaders. A second thing that I've seen in my life that I think has really hurt people with the capacity to be a leader is the fear of failure. That's a powerful thing in human beings. And in some individuals with great talent, their egos are so fragile that they can't risk failure. But to live is to be vulnerable. To live is not to make everything successful. That's part of life. And it's how we handle that, and it's how the people around us help us handle that, that makes all the difference in the world.